Above the skies of Caen, France, on April 8, 1943, at an altitude of 27,000 feet, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermichen couldn't suppress the grin spreading across his face beneath his oxygen mask as he observed the bulky silhouettes struggling upward through the pristine clarity of his Focke-Wulf 190A5's canopy. The experienced ace from Jagdgeschwader 26, a veteran at age 27, examined the American fighters making their first appearance in combat over occupied European territory. He keyed his radio transmitter to reach his wingman, amusement evident in his voice as he described what he saw below. "The Americans have delivered us flying milk jugs," he announced, barely containing his laughter while watching the enormous Republic P-47 Thunderbolts fighting for every foot of altitude. Beneath Hermichen's formation, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts belonging to the 4th Fighter Group labored skyward in disciplined formation, their massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engines generating 2,000 horsepower, yet struggling against the aircraft's 7-ton mass. German pilots familiar with the graceful Supermarine Spitfires and agile Soviet fighters found these portly American machines almost laughable in appearance. The fighters featured barrel-like fuselages crowned with bubble canopies resembling greenhouses, wings appearing inadequately sized for supporting such massive bodies, and propellers larger than anything currently serving in the Luftwaffe's inventory. Hermichen remained ignorant, as did every German pilot circling predatorily overhead, that they were observing the debut of the weapon destined to methodically annihilate the Luftwaffe's fighter forces. These objects of mockery would undergo a complete transformation within 18 months, evolving from sources of ridicule into instruments inspiring genuine terror, their .850 caliber Browning machine guns producing what would become the most dreaded sound throughout German-controlled airspace. The instruments of destruction were already armed and ready in those substantial wings, carrying 3,400 rounds of ammunition capable of delivering a combined rate of fire reaching 6,000 rounds per minute, sufficient concentrated firepower to saw a Messerschmitt fighter completely in half in under 2 seconds of sustained fire. The transformation's beginning occurred that April morning when Major Donald Blakesley, leading the 335th Fighter Squadron, identified the German formation maneuvering into attack position. The former Eagle Squadron veteran had transferred from Royal Air Force Spitfires mere weeks previously, and he understood what his inexperienced pilots had yet to learn about survival in the P-47, requiring the abandonment of conventional air combat wisdom. The Thunderbolt represented a revolutionary deviation from traditional fighter aircraft design philosophy pursued by other nations. While German engineers had focused on developing lightweight interceptors optimized for superior climb rates and turning performance, Republic Aviation had engineered something without precedent in aviation history, a high-altitude juggernaut employing mass, raw power, and overwhelming firepower to fundamentally rewrite aerial warfare's established rules. Among the 56 American pilots distributed throughout the French sky that morning were men destined for legendary status, future aces whose names would eventually strike fear into Luftwaffe hearts across Europe. However, on this particular April day in 1943, they were novices flying an unproven machine against what was arguably the world's most combat-experienced fighter force. The Germans had maintained continuous combat operations since 1939, their pilots seasoned through campaigns in Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. The Americans opposing them had accumulated exactly 0 days of actual combat experience. This narrative explores how industrial logic ultimately defeated tactical brilliance, how quantity merged with quality to create overwhelming superiority, and how German pilots' initial laughter transformed into genuine terror upon discovering what synchronized Browning machine guns could accomplish against aircraft at 400 yards range. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt emerged from desperate circumstances in June 1940 as German fighters swept across France. Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, received urgent specifications from the United States Army Air Forces demanding a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's finest fighters. What Kartveli designed instead exceeded those specifications dramatically, creating a monster that redefined aviation possibilities. Kartveli admitted to his design team that the aircraft would resemble a dinosaur, but promised it would be a dinosaur possessing excellent proportions. The XP-47B prototype's maiden flight on May 6, 1941, shocked everyone who witnessed it. Weighing 9,900 pounds empty, the aircraft exceeded its predecessor's weight, the P-43 Lancer, by 65%. The massive turbo-supercharger system featuring complex ducting running through the rear fuselage created an almost pregnant appearance that drew unflattering comparisons. Test pilots approaching the aircraft initially invariably posed the identical question about whether this massive machine could actually achieve flight. Not only did the aircraft fly, but its performance at altitude exceeded anything previously achieved. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, an 18-cylinder radial generating 2,000 horsepower, maintained full power output at 27,000 feet, where German fighters struggled for air. The turbo supercharger, fed by exhaust gases, delivered sea-level engine performance in the stratosphere, where atmospheric density proved too thin for conventional supercharger systems to function effectively. Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group during training at Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially despised the aircraft with considerable justification. His unit suffered 18 pilot fatalities and 41 aircraft destroyed in training accidents between September 1942 and January 1943, meaning the P-47 killed more Americans during training than Germans would destroy in the initial months of combat operations. The aircraft demonstrated alarming tendencies, including ground loops during landing procedures, torque rolls during takeoff, and such enthusiasm for diving that pilots discovered compressibility effects firsthand as shock waves formed on the wings, freezing control surfaces. Yet pilots who successfully mastered the Thunderbolt discovered something extraordinary about its capabilities. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma destined to become one of America's top-scoring aces with 27 confirmed victories, described his initial flight experience as resembling strapping oneself to a locomotive, emphasizing the unbelievable power that didn't require flying the aircraft so much as aiming it toward targets. The initial combat encounters during April and May 1943 appeared to confirm every prejudice German pilots harbored about American fighter design. The P-47s demonstrated inability to turn with Focke-Wulf 1-90s, couldn't match Messerschmitt 109s in climbing performance, and lacked the nimble handling characteristics German fighters possessed at medium altitudes. Luftwaffe pilots rapidly developed tactical approaches exploiting these apparent weaknesses, attacking from below where the heavy Thunderbolt struggled most, forcing turning engagements where agility mattered more than overwhelming firepower. Hauptmann Josef Pips Priller, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26, filed reports to headquarters following his first encounter with a new American fighter, describing it as meat ready for slaughter that flew like a truck, turned like a freight train, and climbed like a pregnant cow, with his pilots mockingly calling them Indianer, fat targets merely pretending to be warriors. Statistical evidence from the first month of operations appeared to support German confidence in their tactical superiority. American fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts while achieving only 3 confirmed German kills, a ratio suggesting the Americans had made a serious error in fighter selection. The Royal Air Force, observing from their Spitfire squadrons, quietly suggested the Americans might reconsider their choice of mount, with British pilots joking that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 involved unstrapping and running around the aircraft's roomy cockpit to confuse pursuing German fighters. Something strange was occurring in those early encounters that German intelligence analysts failed to recognize or appreciate. The P-47s being shot down had absorbed incredible punishment before finally falling from the sky. One particular aircraft returned from a May 4th mission bearing 21 cannon holes plus over 100 machine gun strikes, damage sufficient to have completely disintegrated a Messerschmitt or Spitfire into falling debris. The massive radial engine, lacking vulnerable liquid cooling systems present in German and British fighters, shrugged off battle damage that would have instantly stopped any liquid-cooled fighter. More significantly, when P-47s successfully positioned their guns on target, the results proved catastrophic for German aircraft. The Thunderbolt's weapons battery created a convergence zone of destruction that German pilots had never previously experienced in aerial combat. Unlike rifle-caliber weapons equipping early war fighters or cannons with severely limited ammunition capacity, the American fighter maintained sustained fire exceeding 30 seconds duration, an eternity in aerial combat where engagements typically lasted seconds. The event beginning the transformation of German perceptions occurred on June 26, 1943, over Laval, France, involving 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron in an encounter that would achieve legendary status among both American and German aviators. Johnson's formation of 8 P-47s was returning from bomber escort duty when they were bounced by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from 2nd Group of Jagdgeschwader 26, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, younger brother of the famous Adolf Galland. The Germans executed what appeared to be a perfect attack, diving from the sun with overwhelming speed advantage that should have guaranteed success. Johnson's Thunderbolt, flying at the rear of the formation, was caught in crossfire from multiple attackers, absorbing catastrophic damage in the engagement's first seconds. 21 20mm cannon shells exploded across his aircraft structure. The canopy shattered into fragments, hydraulic fluid sprayed throughout the cockpit, creating visibility problems. The engine cowling was torn away, exposing internal components, and fire erupted behind the instrument panel, threatening to engulf the cockpit. Johnson, wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel and bullet fragments, attempted to bail out, but discovered the canopy had jammed shut. A 20mm shell had exploded in the canopy track, welding it permanently closed. He was trapped in a dying aircraft at 27,000 feet with no apparent means of escape. What transpired next defied every assumption about combat damage tolerance that either side possessed. Despite having zero forward visibility through the oil-covered windscreen, an engine barely functioning and shaking violently enough to threaten breaking its mounts and controls responding only intermittently to his inputs, Johnson somehow managed to level the aircraft and point it toward England. The P-47 continued flying with damage that should have reduced any other contemporary fighter to falling, debris scattering across the French countryside. Then, Johnson's situation deteriorated further, beyond what seemed possible to survive. A lone Focke-Wulf 190, flown by an unknown pilot from 2nd Group of Jagdgeschwader 26, discovered the crippled Thunderbolt limping toward the English Channel at less than 170 miles per hour. Historical research has never definitively identified this particular pilot, though several names have been proposed based on German combat reports filed that day. What followed became one of aerial warfare history's most extraordinary encounters between individual pilots. The German pilot positioned himself directly behind Johnson's P-47 and opened fire with his 4 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns at point-blank range. Johnson, unable to take any evasive action, could only huddle behind his armor plate and pray for survival. The Thunderbolt absorbed the German fighter's entire cannon ammunition load without falling from the sky. The German pilot then repositioned his aircraft and fired again, this time employing only his machine guns after exhausting his cannon ammunition. Johnson watched in his mirror as the German pilot pulled alongside, staring with apparent disbelief at the flying wreck still maintaining flight. Johnson could observe his antagonist's face clearly. Young, blonde-haired, his expression visibly shifting from confidence to confusion to something approaching fear or awe. The German repositioned once more and emptied his remaining machine gun ammunition into the Thunderbolt in a final attempt to destroy it. Still, the American fighter refused to fall. The German pulled alongside again, shook his head in what appeared to be amazement at what he was witnessing, rendered an informal salute, acknowledging Johnson's incredible survival, and peeled away, presumably having exhausted all ammunition. Johnson's P-47 eventually landed at Manston, with its engine failing as the aircraft rolled down the runway. The crew chief stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 200 individual strikes. One cannon shell had exploded mere inches from Johnson's head. Another had detonated directly against the armor plate positioned behind his seat. The engine had absorbed multiple direct hits. The control cables were partially severed. 3 of the 4 main longerons, the structural backbone of the fuselage, were shot completely through. Yet somehow the aircraft had brought him home alive. The survival of Johnson's aircraft sent shockwaves through both air forces for entirely different reasons. American engineers studying the wreckage realized they had fundamentally underestimated their own creation's structural strength and damage tolerance. German intelligence receiving combat reports from 2nd Group of Jagdgeschwader 26 initially refused to believe the reports, insisting no aircraft could absorb that volume of punishment and continue flying. But testimony from multiple pilots who had witnessed the engagement confirmed what seemed impossible. The Thunderbolt had absorbed everything the Luftwaffe's best fighter could deliver and had survived to return home. By July 1943, American pilots were beginning to understand and exploit the P-47's genuine strengths rather than attempting to fight in ways that highlighted its weaknesses. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke, the 56th Fighter Group commander, had discovered the secret through brutal trial and error costing lives. His tactical directive to his pilots was straightforward. Never attempt to turn with German fighters. Never try climbing with them at low altitude. Instead, use the Thunderbolt's weight advantage. Use its overwhelming power. Use its devastating guns to maximum effect. The Thunderbolt's massive weight, initially perceived as a fundamental disadvantage, became a tactical weapon when properly employed. In a dive from altitude, nothing in the Luftwaffe inventory could catch it. From 30,000 feet, a P-47 could reach 550 miles per hour, faster than any German fighter could achieve, even in a vertical dive with full power. This speed advantage could be converted to altitude through a zoom climb that left pursuing fighters helplessly behind, unable to follow. Captain Walker Bud Mahurin, destined to become one of the first American aces in the European theater, developed what became known among pilots as the boom and zoom tactic, though many pilots simply called it the Thunderbolt turkey shoot in recognition of how one-sided these engagements became. Instead of engaging in traditional dogfighting involving continuous turning at relatively low speeds, P-47 formations would climb to 30,000 feet or higher, well above where German fighters could effectively operate for extended periods. When Luftwaffe fighters appeared below, the Thunderbolts would roll inverted and dive nearly vertically, reaching speeds making deflection shooting essentially impossible for defending German pilots to execute accurately. At the bottom of these dives, the American heavy machine guns would speak their devastating message, and German pilots who survived these attacks described facing what seemed like a wall of lead, the combined firepower creating an essentially impenetrable zone of destruction through which nothing could pass intact. Aircraft caught in this convergence pattern didn't merely fall damaged from the sky. They literally disintegrated into fragments. The true revelation of concentrated American firepower manifested during the August 17, 1943, dual raids against Schweinfurt and Regensburg, representing the deepest penetration into Germany attempted to that date. This mission demonstrated both the P-47's operational limitations, its range proving insufficient even with external fuel tanks, and its terrifying effectiveness when properly employed within its operational radius. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, encountered a formation of Messerschmitt 110 destroyer aircraft positioning themselves to attack B-17 formations with their heavy cannons and rocket armament. The twin-engine German fighters, heavily armed but significantly less maneuverable than single-engine fighters, served as the Luftwaffe's specialized bomber destroyers. Schilling's flight of 4 Thunderbolts rolled into their attack dive from 28,000 feet altitude. Unteroffizier Henrik Roth, serving as a gunner in one of the Messerschmitt 110s who survived the encounter, later recounted during prisoner interrogation that the American fighters descended like hammers falling from heaven. He opened fire at 800 meters range, observing good hits striking the lead fighter's wing structure. The P-47 didn't even wobble from the impacts, then opened fire with its own weapons. The aircraft positioned ahead of Roth's position simply ceased to exist as a recognizable aircraft, not merely shot down but utterly destroyed. Wings separated from fuselage, tail section severed completely, the crew compartment shredded into metal confetti. In approximately 2 seconds, an intact Messerschmitt 110 transformed into nothing but falling debris and smoke. 8 Messerschmitt 110s were destroyed in less than 60 seconds of combat. The German pilots and crew members had never experienced such concentrated, devastating firepower from fighter aircraft. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, totaling 3,400 rounds weighing nearly 900 pounds. At convergence distance, typically set at 300 yards, all 8 guns' ballistic paths intersected in a zone roughly 6 feet in diameter. Anything positioned in that zone faced 100 half-inch projectiles per second, each traveling at 2,900 feet per second velocity with devastating kinetic energy. The ammunition itself represented a revelation of American industrial capacity and technical sophistication. While German fighters struggled with severely limited cannon ammunition, typically carrying 120 to 200 rounds for 20-millimeter weapons, American pilots could maintain continuous fire for over 30 seconds without exhausting their ammunition supply. The standard combat load mixed armor-piercing incendiary, armor-piercing incendiary tracer, and standard ball ammunition in carefully designed patterns intended to both destroy aircraft structure and ignite fuel and hydraulic systems. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, who would become the top American ace in the European theater with 28 confirmed victories, described the effect of concentrated fire from 8 guns striking a target simultaneously as not merely shooting down enemy aircraft, but causing them to explode catastrophically. He witnessed a Messerschmitt 109 literally cut in half by the volume of fire, the tail section falling in one direction while the nose and wings tumbled in, another, the pilot, never knowing what struck him. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe was discovering another horrifying reality about P-47 capabilities that fundamentally altered the tactical equation. Thunderbolt performance improved dramatically with increasing altitude while German fighters suffered progressive performance degradation. The turbo-supercharged double Wasp engine maintained its rated power output up to 30,000 feet altitude. German fighters relying on single-stage or two-stage mechanical superchargers experienced significant performance degradation above 25,000 feet, where atmospheric density dropped below critical thresholds for mechanical supercharger efficiency. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with 206 confirmed victories earned on both Eastern and Western fronts, encountered this operational reality with fatal consequences on October 8, 1943. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 against a B-17 formation at 28,000 feet over Bremen, Philipp discovered his Focke-Wulf 190A6, becoming sluggish and unresponsive in the thin air nearly 6 miles above Earth's surface. The BMW 801 engine, powerful and reliable at medium altitudes, was literally gasping for oxygen in the stratosphere. When P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group dove on Philipp's formation from 32,000 feet, the German fighters became sitting ducks unable to maneuver effectively. Robert Johnson, now an experienced combat pilot accumulating victories toward ace status, was flying at 31,000 feet when he identified Philipp's distinctive Focke-Wulf featuring elaborate nose art. Johnson's combat report maintained clinical precision, stating he opened fire at 300 yards range with 30-degree deflection angle, observed strikes along the entire fuselage length, and noted the enemy aircraft exploded catastrophically with no parachute observed. Philipp's death sent shockwaves throughout the Luftwaffe command structure. If one of their finest pilots, a man who had survived over 500 combat missions on both Eastern and Western fronts, couldn't survive encounters with Thunderbolts, what realistic chance did average pilots possess? The German High Command ordered immediate investigation into P-47 capabilities to understand what they faced. The report delivered to Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring in November 1943 contained sobering assessments. The Thunderbolt service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any German operational fighter could reach. Its dive speed approached the sound barrier under certain conditions. Its armor protection included 3/8-inch steel plate positioned behind the pilot, half-inch bulletproof glass windscreen, and armored deflection plates surrounding the engine compartment. Most disturbingly for German planners, the aircraft's rugged construction allowed it to absorb damage sufficient to destroy 3 conventional fighters, yet still return home operational. In January 1944, a new P-47 variant began arriving in England that would complete the transformation from object of mockery to instrument of terror. The P-47 D-22 featured a Hamilton standard hydraulic propeller with paddle blades measuring 13 feet in diameter, featuring broad cord blades that bit into thin air like massive oars pulling through water. The improvement in climb rate proved immediate and dramatic in combat operations. Where earlier Thunderbolt variants had climbed at an anemic 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, the paddle blade variants could achieve 3,000 feet per minute, matching or exceeding German fighters' climb performance at most combat-relevant altitudes. The massive propeller also improved acceleration characteristics, allowing P-47s to build energy faster in level flight, reducing vulnerability during the critical moments following combat when aircraft were most susceptible to attack. Hauptmann Heinrich Knocker of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran with over 200 combat missions, encountered the new variants during February 1944 while attempting bomber interception near Hanover. He recorded in his combat diary that the formerly sluggish American fighters had learned to climb effectively, fundamentally altering tactical equations. His unit bounced to formation near Hanover, expecting their usual altitude advantage, but the Americans turned directly into the attack and climbed with them, matching their climb rate. When German pilots attempted to disengage using their previously reliable altitude advantage, the Thunderbolts followed them upward to 30,000 feet. Schmitt, one of Knocker's pilots, was caught and blown apart by concentrated fire, nothing remaining but smoke and falling fragments. These were definitively not the same machines that had generated laughter the previous year. The paddle blade propeller accomplished more than performance improvement. It fundamentally changed the Thunderbolt's acoustic signature. The distinctive thundering roar created by blade tips reaching transonic speeds could be detected from miles distant. German ground troops reported identifying approaching P-47s by sound alone, a deep threatening rumble that meant death approaching from above. They began calling it Donnerschlag, thunderclap, a name carrying psychological weight beyond mere description. By March 1944, P-47s equipped with external fuel tanks could escort bombers deep into German territory, finally providing the protection bomber crews desperately needed. Standard configuration carried two 108-gallon wing tanks or a single 75-gallon belly tank extending operational range beyond 1,000 miles. With the paddle blade propeller providing improved performance even when heavily loaded, Thunderbolts could engage in combat on equal terms immediately after dropping external tanks rather than requiring time to accelerate and climb as earlier variants had needed. The Luftwaffe's response involved concentrating on bomber formations directly, hoping to inflict losses sufficient to halt the American daylight bombing campaign. However, this tactical approach required flying directly through the P-47 escort screen, an increasingly suicidal proposition as American pilots gained experience and confidence. German pilots developed grudging respect bordering on genuine fear for the massive American fighters. Major Günther Rall, one of Germany's top scoring aces with 275 victories primarily earned on the Eastern Front, survived an encounter with P-47s on March 6, 1944, that left him severely wounded and ended his combat career. He recalled years later in a post-war interview that his formation had observed Thunderbolts above them, fat silhouettes positioned against the sun. Someone had laughed and made a joke about flying pigs approaching. Nobody was laughing 30 seconds later when the Americans dove like an avalanche, moving faster than German pilots could effectively react. The first pass destroyed 3 fighters immediately, aircraft simply ceasing to exist and transforming into burning debris falling earthward. The American guns didn't fire in short bursts as German weapons typically did. They poured out solid streams of fire, creating kill zones nothing could survive. Getting caught in that concentrated fire stream meant instant death with no possibility of escape or survival. The long-range escort missions revealed another P-47 advantage that German planners hadn't anticipated: exceptional endurance. While German fighters operated at maximum power settings that consumed fuel rapidly, forcing frequent returns to base for refueling, the large American radials could cruise efficiently at high altitude for extended periods. Thunderbolts could remain with bomber formations for hours, rotating top cover positions while maintaining sufficient fuel reserves for combat maneuvering and safe return to base. As increasing numbers of P-51 Mustangs arrived to assume long-range escort duties in spring 1944, P-47 units increasingly focused on ground attack operations, a role that would make them the most feared aircraft in the German arsenal across all services, not merely the Luftwaffe. The transition to ground attack began earnestly in April 1944 as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France. The Thunderbolt's heavy machine gun battery proved equally effective against ground targets as it had against aircraft. The standard armor-piercing incendiary ammunition could penetrate top armor of most German vehicles, while sheer volume of fire could destroy soft targets in seconds. A 2-second burst delivered 160 half-inch projectiles into a target area the size of a truck. However, the addition of bombs and rockets transformed the P-47 into a genuine multi-role monster capable of devastating ground attacks. The D-25 variant could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pound bomb under the fuselage, a bomb load equaling early war medium bombers. Later variants added zero-length rocket stubs for 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each rocket equivalent to a 105mm artillery shell in destructive potential. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced P-47 ground attacks firsthand and never forgot the experience. He described them approaching low, so low you could observe pilots' faces clearly. The sound was absolutely terrifying. Engines roaring at full power, rockets screaming through air, then the hammering of those heavy machine guns creating percussion felt in your chest. A column of 20 trucks simply ceased to exist, transformed into burning wreckage in a single pass, lasting mere seconds. The psychological effect on his men was utterly devastating. Soldiers called them Jabos, an abbreviation for Jagdbomber or fighter bomber, but these were something transcending that category. They were flying artillery possessing accuracy rivaling snipers. On June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe discovered how completely the balance of power had shifted in the Allies' favor. Over 500 P-47s provided air cover for the invasion of Normandy, creating an essentially impenetrable umbrella over the beaches where Allied forces were landing. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were systematically massacred. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader II, one of only 3 German pilots who managed to reach the beaches that day, reported the sky belonged entirely to the Americans. Thunderbolts were stacked from sea level to 30,000 feet in layered formations. His unit attempted breaking through at dawn with 12 fighters from their Gruppe. Fischer was the sole pilot to return alive from that mission. The P-47s were positioned, waiting at every altitude imaginable. German pilots couldn't climb over them, couldn't dive under them, couldn't break through their defensive layers. American guns transformed German fighters into what Fischer described as aluminum rain falling from the sky. In the weeks following D-Day, P-47 systematically destroyed German movement capability during daylight hours. The statistics compiled proved staggering in scope. During June alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts claimed 651 locomotives destroyed, 3,847 trucks destroyed, 512 tanks and armored vehicles destroyed, and 4,553 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. The Wehrmacht was forced into moving only under darkness, severely hampering their ability to respond effectively to Allied advances and concentrate forces for counterattacks. The Germans attempted everything imaginable to counter the Thunderbolt threat. They reinforced vehicle armor, deployed additional anti-aircraft guns across the theater, developed new camouflage techniques attempting to hide from aerial observation. Nothing worked effectively. The P-47's combination of speed, armor protection, and overwhelming firepower made them nearly unstoppable in the ground attack role. Even the feared 88mm flak guns struggled to track fast-moving fighters at low altitude, where the aircraft presented difficult deflection angles. While devastating effects were being achieved in Europe, the P-47 was simultaneously proving its worth in the Pacific theater against Japanese forces. The 348th Fighter Group operating from New Guinea discovered that Thunderbolt qualities were perfectly suited to the vast distances and harsh environmental conditions characterizing the Pacific War. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th, developed tactics specifically optimized for Pacific conditions and enemy characteristics. On October 11, 1943, Kirby led 4 P-47s against 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak, personally shooting down 6 enemy planes in a single mission, an achievement that earned him the Medal of Honor. The Japanese, accustomed to fighting nimble but fragile American fighters, were completely unprepared for the P-47's combination of overwhelming firepower and exceptional durability against battle damage. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, who encountered P-47s over New Guinea and survived to write about his experiences, described them as monsters. Japanese 20mm cannon, which could destroy a P-40 with relatively few hits, seemed to produce no effect whatsoever on Thunderbolts. Sakai reported putting dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watching it simply fly away, apparently undamaged. The American return fire was absolutely terrifying. Streams of heavy bullets that literally tore aircraft apart into fragments. The P-47N variant, developed specifically for Pacific operations, featured increased fuel capacity with wet wings holding 93 gallons each, extending operational range to 2,350 miles. This variant would escort B-29 Superfortresses all the way to Japan, proving that the supposedly short-legged fighter of 1943 had evolved into a genuine long-range weapon system. Perhaps the ultimate vindication of the P-47's evolution came through its encounters with German jet fighters. The Messerschmitt Me-262, with its 540 mile-per-hour top speed, should theoretically have been completely untouchable by propeller-driven fighters. However, Thunderbolt pilots discovered they could catch jets in 2 specific situations: during takeoff and landing sequences when jets were most vulnerable and moving relatively slowly, and in high-speed dives from altitude where the P-47's exceptional dive performance allowed reaching speeds approaching those of jets in level flight. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to shoot down an Me-262 while flying a P-47. Diving from 28,000 feet, Meyer's Thunderbolt reached speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, fast enough to catch the jet during level flight. The German jet pilot, confident in his aircraft's speed advantage, apparently never observed the diving P-47 until Meyer's guns opened fire at 400 yards range. Meyer's combat report noted the enemy aircraft disintegrated completely under concentrated fire, with large pieces, including both engines, separating from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape successfully. The concentrated fire from 850 caliber guns proved more effective than anticipated against jet aircraft construction. By early 1945, specialized P-47M variants were deployed specifically to counter German jets and V-1 flying bombs. With water methanol injection boosting power output to 2,800 horsepower and refined aerodynamics throughout, these ultimate Thunderbolts could reach 470 miles per hour in level flight at 30,000 feet. Fast enough to intercept even jets under certain tactical conditions. Major George Bostwick, commanding the 63rd Fighter Squadron equipped with P-47Ms, destroyed 2 Me-262s during March 1945. His tactical report emphasized firepower advantages over pure speed, noting that jets were faster but couldn't turn effectively and couldn't absorb punishment. One good burst from American battery armament and jet fighters came apart as though constructed from paper. Jets had to slow down considerably to attack bombers effectively, and the deceleration created vulnerability where American fighters could engage them successfully. The ultimate demonstration of American industrial might manifested during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate attempt to destroy Allied air power on the ground on January 1, 1945. Nearly 900 German fighters, including their best remaining pilots, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the initial attack succeeded in destroying 22 Thunderbolts on the ground, along with several other aircraft types. A captured German pilot brought to the command post pointed at burning aircraft and taunted American personnel, asking what they thought of that demonstration. Major George Brookings' response became legendary throughout the 9th Air Force as he pointed toward the flight line where ground crews were already pushing damaged aircraft aside and preparing parking positions for replacements, stating that by tomorrow they would have 40 new aircraft. He then asked the German pilot how long it would take Germany to replace their pilots lost in this operation. The German pilot's smirk disappeared completely as he contemplated the implications. Within 48 hours, factory-fresh P-47 D-40s filled the flight line, flown in from depots in England, ready for immediate combat operations. The Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots in Bodenplatte, including many irreplaceable instructors and experienced squadron leaders. These losses could never be replaced given Germany's deteriorating situation. The Americans lost 134 aircraft total across all attacked airfields, every single aircraft replaced within 1 week. The raw numbers told the story of inevitable defeat far more eloquently than words. Republic Aviation produced 15,683 P-47s during the war, more than any other American fighter type. At peak production rates, the Farmingdale factory on Long Island completed 1 Thunderbolt every 60 minutes around the clock. The Evansville plant in Indiana, built from empty farmland in 1942, was producing 500 aircraft monthly by 1944. Each P-47D required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. The engine alone contained 2,400 individual components, machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Yet American workers, many of them women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with precision exceeding peacetime manufacturing standards. The ammunition production proved equally staggering in scale. Each P-47 sortie required 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, and with hundreds of Thunderbolts flying daily missions, ammunition consumption exceeded 10 million rounds monthly by mid-1944. The Lake City Arsenal in Missouri, one of several ammunition production facilities, produced 30 million rounds monthly. Each cartridge manufactured to tolerances measured in 10,000ths of an inch, ensuring reliable feeding through synchronized gun mechanisms. Fuel consumption was enormous on a scale difficult to comprehend. Each Thunderbolt burned 100 gallons per hour during normal flight operations, up to 300 gallons hourly during combat with water injection, engaged for maximum power. The 9th Air Force alone consumed over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel monthly by late 1944. All of it required shipping across the Atlantic in tankers that were themselves products of American mass production capabilities operating on unprecedented scales. Even more impressive than aircraft production was pilot training infrastructure and output. By 1944, the United States was graduating 30,000 pilots annually from advanced training programs, more pilots than Germany had trained during the entire war to that point. Each P-47 pilot received minimum 400 hours of flight training before entering combat operations, including 100 hours in advanced fighters specifically. German pilots, by contrast, were entering combat with less than 100 hours total flight time by war's end due to fuel shortages and aircraft availability. Training. Quality showed dramatically in combat outcomes. American pilots arrived in European theaters, trained in formation flying, instrument navigation, gunnery techniques, and tactical doctrine. They had practiced against captured German aircraft types, thoroughly understanding enemy capabilities and limitations. They knew their aircraft systems intimately, having studied comprehensive technical manuals that German pilots never received due to material shortages. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, arriving in England during September 1944, exemplified the American training advantage perfectly. His logbook showed 420 hours total time, including 75 hours specifically in P-47s. He had fired at towed targets extensively, practiced deflection shooting against maneuvering targets, and studied gun camera film from actual combat engagements. On his first combat mission, he knew exactly what to do and how to do it effectively. The German pilot he faced couldn't have possessed half his experience level. It wasn't remotely a fair fight given the disparity in preparation. In March 1945, Oberst Josef Priller, the same pilot who had mocked P-47s as pregnant cows 2 years earlier, was interviewed by German propaganda officials seeking material to boost civilian and military morale. His statement was deemed too demoralizing for publication, revealing the complete transformation in German attitudes toward American capabilities. Priller stated the Thunderbolt was the finest fighter bomber ever built by any nation. Its firepower was absolutely unprecedented. Weapons that never jammed, never overheated, never exhausted ammunition during normal combat operations. It carried bomb loads equal to medium bombers, fired rockets comparable to artillery, and fought as effectively as dedicated fighters when circumstances required. But beyond the machine itself was what it represented: unlimited American production capacity. Americans lose 10 aircraft and build 20 replacements. Germans lose one, and it's gone forever without replacement. American pilots arrived better trained than German instructors. They possessed fuel for training flights, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything imaginable. Germans had nothing remaining but courage, and courage without adequate resources represented merely delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943, Priller admitted. We're definitely not laughing now. When you hear those guns opening fire, you know death has come calling. The sound haunts survivors. Mechanical, precise, utterly unstoppable. Like everything American, it's fundamentally about overwhelming material superiority. They didn't defeat us through superior tactics or braver pilots. They buried us under an avalanche of steel and lead that never stopped falling. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper only. Fuel shortages grounded most remaining aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead, captured, or too wounded for further combat. Airfields were cratered ruins from Allied bombing. But even with aircraft and fuel theoretically available, German pilots faced an impossible tactical equation. Attacking meant facing P-47 formations that owned every altitude from ground level to 40,000 feet with overwhelming numbers and firepower. Feldwebel Klaus Bretschneider, one of the final German pilots trained during 1945, flew exactly one combat mission before war's end. His encounter with P-47s over Leipzig lasted 12 seconds total. He observed them diving from above, 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation geometry. He attempted turning to evade, but they were moving too fast to avoid. The leader opened fire from 500 meters range. His aircraft shook as though struck by sledgehammers. The engine exploded catastrophically, the wing separated from fuselage. He barely escaped the disintegrating fighter. Descending in his parachute, he watched American fighters destroy his entire staffel systematically. 6 fighters gone in under 60 seconds. The sky rained burning aluminum and bodies. The psychological impact on German forces was complete and devastating. German pilots developed what medical officers termed Jabo fever, actual physical symptoms of stress appearing when Thunderbolts were reported in operational areas. Veterans who had faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without fear became physically ill before missions against P-47s. The distinctive thunder of approaching Thunderbolts caused panic among ground troops who understood that survival meant finding substantial cover immediately. The final statistics from P-47 operations defied easy comprehension. In European operations, 3,752 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 3,315 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 86,000 railway cars destroyed, 9,000 locomotives destroyed, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles destroyed, 68,000 trucks destroyed, 60,000 horse-drawn vehicles destroyed. In Pacific operations, 697 Japanese aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 150 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 1,500 vehicles destroyed, 150 locomotives destroyed, plus countless barges, ships, and installations obliterated. The 9th Air Force alone, primarily equipped with P-47s, flew 213,873 combat sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of ammunition, and launched 60,000 rockets during the war. Thunderbolt units achieved 4.6 to 1 kill ratio in aerial combat while maintaining the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter-bomber type. Behind these statistics lay the human cost that numbers alone cannot adequately convey. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 28,000 pilots, killed in combat against Western Allied forces. Many fell to concentrated fire from American heavy. Machine guns delivering overwhelming firepower in seconds. Each loss represented years of training Germany could never replace given their deteriorating situation. By war's end, the average German fighter pilot possessed less than 30 hours of combat experience. The average P-47 pilot had accumulated over 200 combat hours. At the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center at Oberleutnant, captured Allied pilots were systematically debriefed by German intelligence personnel. Records captured in 1945 revealed German assessments of Allied aircraft types, updated continuously throughout the war. The file on the P-47 showed complete reversal of opinion over time. April 1943 assessment described a large, unmaneuverable fighter inferior to German types in all performance parameters except dive speed, with machine gun armament deemed insufficient against cannon-armed fighters, overall assessment rating it a minimal threat. December 1943 assessment noted exceptional high-altitude performance, extreme structural strength, firepower becoming increasingly problematic, and pilots showing improved tactical employment, upgrading the assessment to significant threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944, assessment acknowledged dominant fighter-bomber capabilities, superior to all German types above 20,000 feet, devastating firepower against all target types, and structural strength making shootdowns extremely difficult, elevating the assessment to critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945. Assessment concluded the P-47 was the finest fighter bomber of the war. Its combination of firepower, durability, and performance unmatched by any other aircraft. Pilot quality exceptional, with final assessment being unsurvivable in direct engagement under most circumstances. In 1985, at a reunion of German and American fighter pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, former adversaries met peacefully to share experiences. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, former commander of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, was asked specifically about the P-47 Thunderbolt. His response, recorded on video, captured the complete transformation of German opinion. "We made a terrible mistake in 1943, Galland admitted. We observed this large, heavy fighter and laughed at American incomprehension of air combat fundamentals. They built a bomber and called it a fighter, we said. We were the ones who fundamentally didn't understand. The Americans didn't attempt building a European fighter conforming to our design philosophy. They built an American fighter designed around production capacity, overwhelming firepower, and survivability. They understood that in attritional warfare, the aircraft capable of absorbing punishment while delivering devastating firepower would ultimately prevail. They were absolutely correct. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, I understood everything we had missed," Galland continued. "The power was absolutely incredible. It climbed as though falling upward. The cockpit was comfortable rather than cramped. Visibility was excellent. Controls were precise and responsive. It was genuinely a pilot's aircraft wrapped in armor plating. But what really impressed me was realizing America built over 15,000 of these complex machines while simultaneously fighting a two-ocean war. Each aircraft required an engine more complex than anything Germany produced during the entire war. Yet they manufactured them faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never possessed any realistic chance of victory." "Those guns," Galland reflected, "we called them Roosevelt's piano because of the distinctive sound they produced. Once you heard that sound, you never forgot it for the rest of your life." Many of my friends heard it for the last time. The P-47 didn't merely defeat the Luftwaffe, it systematically destroyed it as an effective fighting force. The P-47's design represented American industrial philosophy perfectly executed. Brute force engineering backed by essentially unlimited resources compared to Germany's situation. Every component was overbuilt, overpowered, and over-engineered beyond minimum requirements. Wing spars could support 40,000 pounds, 3 times the aircraft's maximum loaded weight. The engine mount could withstand 12 G-forces without structural failure. Control cables were doubled throughout with automatic backup systems preventing control loss. The ammunition feed system alone represented a marvel of precision engineering. 8 separate ammunition boxes, each containing 425 rounds, fed through electric boost motors preventing jamming during high G maneuvers. Guns were electrically heated, preventing freezing at extreme altitudes. Each gun possessed its own charging mechanism and could be individually synchronized. Convergence was adjustable from 150 to 400 yards range, allowing pilots to optimize for their preferred engagement distances. Even after the war concluded, some German veterans maintained that the P-47 won through sheer quantity rather than quality. The German fighters were technically superior, but overwhelmed by numbers alone. Combat records tell a markedly different story contradicting this assessment. In engagements where numbers were approximately equal, P-47s consistently prevailed through superior firepower, better pilot training, and structural advantages. The heavy machine gun armament, initially dismissed as inferior to cannon armament, proved more effective in actual combat conditions. Analysis of gun camera footage revealed why this occurred. Cannon shells, while individually more destructive, required precise aim and possessed severely limited ammunition, typically 120 to 200 rounds total. The P-47's weapons created what analysts termed a probability cloud of projectiles that guaranteed hits even with imperfect aim. At typical engagement ranges, a 2-second burst placed at least 20 rounds into a fighter-sized target, more than sufficient to ensure destruction. The ammunition itself was qualitatively superior to German cannon shells. American 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds used delayed action fuses, ensuring penetration before detonation. The incendiary compound burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to ignite aluminum structure. German 20mm shells, while heavier and more powerful per round, often exploded on surface contact, causing spectacular but sometimes superficial damage rather than penetrating vital structure. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced by any nation. Its empty weight of 10,000 pounds exceeded the gross weight of some contemporary twin-engine fighters. Its engine produced more horsepower than entire bomber formations from the previous war. Its weapons delivered more firepower than an infantry squad. Yet it was manufactured by the thousands, flown by young men barely out of high school, and maintained under combat conditions by mechanics who learned their trades in mere weeks rather than years. The transformation of German opinion from outright mockery to genuine terror required less than 2 years. In that compressed time frame, the flying milk bottle, derided in 1943, became the most feared aircraft in Luftwaffe experience. Veterans who had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks without flinching spoke of P-47s in hushed, respectful tones decades after the war ended. At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits among other legendary fighters from the war. Its placard lists technical specifications and battle honors accumulated, but the real story is conveyed by a small display case containing spent .50 caliber shell casings and a strip of gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf 190 disintegrating under concentrated fire. Below the display appears a quote from an unnamed German pilot taken from a 1945 interrogation report. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight by our standards. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to turn or climb in the traditional sense. They just pointed those guns at you, and you ceased to exist. The laughter died along with our comrades. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat operations as an object of derision and concluded the war as an instrument of systematic annihilation. In between those points, 8 synchronized Browning machine guns rewrote the established rules of aerial warfare and buried the Luftwaffe under an avalanche of lead that never ceased falling. German pilots had laughed at the ungainly American fighter in April 1943. By May 1945, there were no German pilots remaining to laugh. The Thunder had spoken its final word, and the sky belonged to America.